The sea was calm that morning. Not peaceful, never truly peaceful, but unnervingly still. The North Atlantic stretched out in cold silence, broken only by the distant thrum of engines and the steady rhythm of waves against steel. Only days earlier the balance of naval power had shifted in an instant. A cornerstone of British strength, HMS Hood, had been lost in a matter of minutes, destroyed by a sudden and devastating explosion. In its wake, a new and formidable presence dominated the ocean, the German battleship Bismarck. But by May 27, 1941, the situation had changed. The advantage had shifted. And somewhere in the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic, events were moving toward an unavoidable conclusion. What happens when power reaches its height only to falter in a single moment? How quickly can success turn into something far more uncertain? Because before that day was over, one of the most powerful warships ever built would be lost beneath the sea, taking with it far more than steel and machinery. Before the violence and urgency of battle, there had been routine. Aboard Bismarck, life followed a strict and disciplined pattern. Days began with the sounds of metal on metal, the scent of fuel and salt in the air. Sailors moved in formation. Across the decks their roles clearly defined, their actions precise. The ship itself was a remarkable feat of engineering, over 800 feet long, heavily armored and armed with formidable weaponry. Beneath its surface, a complex network of machinery powered its movement, each system functioning with calculated efficiency. Everything about it reflected careful design and industrial strength. For many of the sailors, some of them very young, Bismarck represented more than a mission. It stood as proof that Germany could challenge the long-standing dominance of the British Royal Navy and possibly succeed. For a short time that belief held. When Bismarck, alongside the cruiser Prinz Eugen, encountered HMS Hood in the Denmark Strait, the engagement was brief but decisive. A well-placed salvo struck Hood with catastrophic effect, igniting its magazines. The ship was lost within minutes. More than 1,400 men went down with it. Only 3 survived. In Britain, the reaction was immediate. The loss was not only strategic, it was deeply symbolic. Hood had represented decades of naval tradition and strength. Its destruction carried emotional weight. The response was clear. Bismarck had to be stopped. What followed was a determined pursuit. The Royal Navy committed significant resources, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, all focused on locating and intercepting a single target moving through the Atlantic. But Bismarck was not without damage. During the earlier engagement, its fuel systems had been compromised. Oil leaked into the sea, creating a trail that could be followed, a vulnerability in an otherwise vast and open ocean. Inside the ship, the mood began to shift. The initial confidence gave way to quiet concern. Officers reviewed maps with increasing urgency. Engineers worked continuously to contain the damage. Gradually, it became clear that the mission had changed. This was no longer about striking outward. It was about getting back. Captain Ernst Lindemann maintained order and composure, but the situation was difficult to ignore. With each passing hour, the likelihood of interception grew, and the British were closing in. The decisive moment came not from a battleship but from the air. From the carrier HMS Ark Royal, a group of ferry swordfish aircraft set out into challenging weather conditions. These planes were slow and appeared outdated compared to more modern designs. But effectiveness in war is not always about speed or appearance. Flying low over rough seas, the crews pressed forward, despite difficult conditions and heavy defensive fire. As they approached, anti-aircraft guns from Bismarck filled the sky. Amid that exchange, one torpedo found its target. It struck near the stern. The damage affected the ship's steering system, leaving the rudder jammed. The impact was critical. Despite its power, Bismarck could no longer control its direction. It began to move in wide, unintentional arcs, unable to break free. A ship built for precision had lost its ability to maneuver. Inside, the situation became clear. They could not escape. As night fell, the atmosphere grew tense. British destroyers approached under cover of darkness, launching intermittent attacks. Their goal was not immediate destruction, but pressure keeping. The crew alert, denying them rest. On board Bismarck, fatigue began to set in. Sleep was scarce. The strain of constant readiness took its toll. Some sailors took quiet moments to write letters. Others spoke in low voices, sharing what little comfort they could. Many remained at their posts, focused on routine holding onto structure in the face of uncertainty. They understood what the coming hours might bring. And beyond the darkness, British forces continued to gather. Morning arrived under a grey sky. Out of the distant, shapes began to form. The battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, supported by additional vessels, moved into position. Bismarck, damaged and isolated, prepared to respond. At 0847, the engagement began. The stillness of the ocean gave way to the sound of heavy guns. Shells crossed the distance between the ships, each carrying immense force. Bismarck returned fire maintaining resistance despite its condition. But the limitations were clear. Without the ability to steer effectively, it could not reposition or avoid incoming fire. British shells began to strike with increasing accuracy. Key systems were damaged. Communication lines were disrupted. The ship's command structure was compromised early in the battle. Admiral Gunther, Lutjens and Captain Lindemann were likely lost in the initial stages, though the exact details remain uncertain. Despite this, the crew continued to operate the ship as best they could. Below-deck efforts continued managing flooding, maintaining systems responding to damage. The environment became increasingly difficult as the situation worsened. One survivor would later describe the experience as overwhelming an environment where structure was breaking down and conditions were rapidly deteriorating. Over time, the transformation became undeniable. Bismarck was no longer functioning as a warship in the way it had been designed. Its main guns fell silent one after another. Critical systems failed. Visible damage spread across the structure. British forces continued their barrage, aiming to ensure the ship could no longer pose a threat. By mid-morning, Bismarck was heavily damaged and listing. Inside decisions had to be made. Some crew members remained at their posts. Others began preparing to abandon the ship. Measures were taken to prevent capture, including efforts to ensure the vessel would not remain afloat. Water continued to enter. The outcome was approaching. At around 10:40 a.m., the ship began to roll. At first gradually, then more rapidly. Objects shifted across the deck. The structure tilted beyond recovery. Moments later, the Bismarck disappeared beneath the surface. In its place, scattered debris and survivors remained in the cold Atlantic waters. In the aftermath, British ships moved to recover those they could. The effort was limited, however, due to concerns about potential submarine threats in the area. Approximately 110 men were rescued. More than 2,000 were lost. The sea closed over the rest. The sinking of Bismarck had immediate and lasting effects. In Britain, it was seen as a necessary response, a restoration of confidence after the loss of Hood. In Germany, it marked a turning point. The risks associated with deploying large surface ships became more apparent. Strategic focus began to shift toward submarine warfare, which operated under very different conditions. More broadly, the engagement highlighted changing realities in naval warfare. Even heavily armored ships could be compromised by a series of smaller, critical failures. A damaged system, a loss of control, a well-placed strike. Large-scale outcomes could hinge on individual moments. Beyond strategy, there were the individuals involved. Sailors, many of them young and inexperienced, faced circumstances they could not fully prepare for. Officers carried responsibility under intense pressure. Families would later receive news that offered little detail, only confirmation of loss. In wartime, events are often measured in outcomes and statistics. But behind those figures are personal experiences, uncertainty, determination, and a sense of duty shaped by circumstances beyond individual control. Today, the remains of Bismarck lie deep beneath the Atlantic. The structure is still recognizable, though broken by time and impact. It rests in darkness, undisturbed, a quiet presence on the ocean floor. Those who have studied it describe a sense of stillness and enduring reminder of what once was. The story of Bismarck is not only about a single ship or a single battle. It reflects a moment when expectations met reality, when strength alone proved insufficient without adaptability, and when events unfolded in ways that could not be fully controlled. It leaves behind a question that continues to resonate. How quickly can certainty give way to uncertainty? Because at sea, as in history, outcomes are rarely fixed, and what appears unbreakable can, under the right conditions, come to an end. The ocean does not preserve reputations. It holds only what remains.